So some of the smartest people in the world, they're considered fools in God's eyes. And we don't always know what to do. And the world looks for answers, but we can easily be deceived by the appeal of the world standards and what it shows. So I want to start off by telling a quick story. Some of you guys may have heard of it. It's called The Emperor's New Clothes. So there was once a king. He was so fascinated by the beauty in clothes and the things that he can attain that every day he had to wear new clothes. And he was so captivated by that idea that in his search and quest for new clothes, he was tricked by these people who said that they make clothes out of the most valuable material. But the people who are unworthy, it becomes invisible. So the king, in his search, he finally found these people, and they said that they would make him clothes. But if he was unworthy, then he would be wearing nothing, or look invisible, and he would be deceived. And the people that, when they look at him and notice his glory and his splendor, would think he's not worthy, he's not a worthy king. So in his fascination of clothes, this idea, because of these clothes, he was tricked into the idea that he has to have it. And he finally attained those clothes. He put it on. Obviously, he was naked. There was invisible material, and the clothes were just non-existent. But he paid these people. So, in his own pride, in his own arrogance, he didn't realize that he was so fascinated and captivated that he had to have these clothes. And by these standards, the people that were in fear of him, they didn't say anything. So he's walking around parading in the streets, and no one said anything until a little boy at the very end started laughing, started calling him out and saying that the king's not wearing anything. And finally, when he realized he actually was wearing nothing, he was made a fool in front of the entire town. And this shows us the blindness that we can have when it comes to our pride, when it comes to the things that we're seeking. When we look at our own wisdom, our own personal joy, and just our personal awareness, it shows us that we're actually fools when we depend on ourselves, when we depend on our pride, and we get blinded by that arrogance. And this is just shown by a simple little boy in this village and in this town. And I wanted to start that going into this message because in James 1, we understand that when we lack wisdom, when we lack understanding, and we deal with these trials, we need to ask God in faith and not have double-mindedness. And the idea behind this is that when we go through difficulties and challenges, which everyone does, when we ask God, we need to make sure that we're not in the back of our mind thinking that God is not going to respond. We need to know that we have hope, and that with prayer and that dependency on God, that He'll know what to do, that He'll tell us what to do. So starting with that, in James 1, 2-4, we see that trials can have a positive effect on our lives. And it reads, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And in college, I had an experience where I faced the challenges of being a leader, of being watched by my peers, by people that were older than me, younger than me. I was part of a college fellowship in InterVarsity, and I felt like my first year when I arrived, it was a very unhealthy place. There was a very questionable practice about fellowship, and we were walking down this path where a lot of people were ready to abandon the fellowship. There was a direction that we were trying to steer it back in the right way. We were trying to engage in more Christ-centered activities. We were trying to continue to do what God's calling is and reaching the campus, but the people weren't interested. So when we turned to our group, that was close to 40 at the time, they weren't able to see it. They didn't see the vision, and they basically threatened that if we continued to go through, that they would leave the group. So after that year, we went from about 40 people to the following year to about 8 people. And at the moment when we arrive, when we get there, we'd think, okay, what is God doing? We had 5 times the number of people, but then we drop. And we don't necessarily see this vision. But after that, we were able to see that God continued to provide. When we went down to 8 people, that was when God started turning it around. We were able to have 8 committed followers, people who had the same vision, the same idea to start moving on campus, instead of 40 people who had different ideas and kind of pulling the ship in different directions, to say. And as we redirected that, we saw people coming to know Christ. We actually saw changes in people's lives and in hearts, and having real encounters with God. So going a little bit deeper, we know that testing of faith causes steadfastness. This is in James 1:3. So we were trying to going a little bit deeper into the story, is this event that we were trying to put on. We tried to join all the different college fellowships, local churches, and all the parachurch organizations on campus. We were trying to partner with International Justice Mission to bring about awareness on human trafficking and sex slavery around the world that is more prominent today than it is during the transatlantic slave period. And something that we had a heart for, something that we believed in. We were trying to express to the campus, let them know what God's heart is in that. And when we faced opposition, when we faced challenges from our own members, our own group, the specific example is people walking into our leadership team meeting and telling us that if we continue, if we move forward, then they're ready to walk out. That they would participate in other activities, or they're ready to basically take a stand. And we were at a crossroads. We seemed to see that what it took to be faithful to God was conflicting with what the world or what our community was telling us to do. And when we were asking ourselves, do we hear out the concerns of this group? Do we follow God's command but risk losing all of our people? Ultimately, we chose to stick with moving through. But this left us in a place of uncertainty. Where would we be left after this? And that idea of trials and persevering remained in our hearts. But we felt in our hearts, we knew that we were doing what was right with God, but we just had to persevere. We had to push through. And in this perseverance, in this struggle, moves us to the next point, that in steadfastness, in full effect, brings completeness, lacking in nothing, in James 1:4. So going in deeper, we saw local churches around the Michigan State campus. That was where I went to college and undergrad. We saw the organizations of InterVarsity, Cru, staff from all over the country came to support. We saw hundreds of people come to know Christ. We had a main event where over 1,200 people came, and we reached an estimate of 20,000 students that were all over the Michigan State campus, which is nearly half the campus. Throughout our week-long events that we were holding in the cafeterias, throughout lunch and dinner, and at nights throughout the week, we had outreach events to basically attract groups together and explain to them what human trafficking is, how much people it affects, how many people it affects currently around the world, and even how it happens within our own country, and we're unaware. So we saw these types of things, even though leading up to it, we didn't know what would happen with our personal fellowship, our own group, our own chapter. But moving forward by faith, we saw God provided, that we were able to see ourselves, the ones that stuck with it. We were able to see hundreds of people come to know Christ. We were able to see 20,000 people be reached, and we were able to see a campus come together for a cause. And things like this, this was the first of its kind, an outreach event of this magnitude, of this size. And so to know that the church can come together in this facet was amazing. And that was a way that God responds and answers, and that we lack nothing, that we have everything in God's provision and in His hands. And moving forward, I want to bring, if we look forward in the James reading, it says that when we ask God for wisdom in faith, He gives it to us. So He will give us wisdom. So the James passage reads, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave in the sea, like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything for the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." And prior to this event, the one that I just explained, I almost left InterVarsity my first year in college after my first semester. But I was asking God for peace. I was asking him for wisdom in what to do. And he told me, I felt a direct call to stay and to watch and see him work. And that's what I saw unfold throughout my life, throughout that year, and the rest of my time in college when I stayed with InterVarsity. So James 1:5 says, "If you lack anything, ask God and receive. And he gives generously without reproach." So after my first semester in college, when I was at the crossroads, when I was trying to decide if I wanted to stay or to go, I approached winter break, and a month prior I signed up for a missions conference that happens every 3 years called Urbana. And I was debating if I even wanted to continue going to that. But in my heart I was thinking, if this is it, God, this is the last event that I'll be with InterVarsity, and I'll look for something else in the second semester. But I already paid for it, I already agreed to it, and my situation was being arranged. But what happened was, when I went, I worshipped with 22,000 people from all over the world, from different countries. I heard amazing testimonies, I met new friends, people from all over the world. And when I was understanding that, I felt like God was telling me, go back into fellowship and share this. Share the things that you've seen, the things that you've heard, but watch me work. And even though I was unsure, even though I didn't know exactly what that was like, I felt like I had to obey. I think when you hear God give you a direct call like that, I was torn, especially facing that first year, facing that first semester. I felt like God gave me a very clear answer, and that was the main thing I asked for, but I didn't want to doubt. So when we doubt, this causes double-mindedness. So the second point here is, do not doubt God when you ask, because this is considered double-minded. So I'm humbled time and time again, especially through my growing process, through my undergraduate years. I would ask God, where do you want me? Where do you want me to serve? Where to go? And I felt like he was leading me to a lot of different places. So he challenged me to go overseas, to do overseas missions that I've done through summer projects in other countries. I didn't know where I was going to raise $4,000 for the missions project for a summer. I didn't know if my parents would say yes. I didn't know if my churches would support me enough. But when I told my staff that I was going to go, that I was going to commit to this, and I was going to try to fundraise and ask around, God provided. That the numbers and the finances may be intimidating, but when I don't doubt, he put the right people to support me. He put the right church, the right friends and family to get in touch with, and I saw some of the greatest changes in one of the poorest regions in China. That we were able to serve students, we were able to meet people that we thought we were going to serve, we thought that we were going to help out, but they ended up serving us. They ended up sharing God's love with us, even though they weren't believers. But we were able to have a heart for these people without questioning what God had in mind. And that's a very big learning process, is that we ask God, we know how difficult the challenge is, but when we doubt, this leads to the deception, the double-mindedness, the questions, if we really have faith in God. And our team worked together very well. I felt like when we put all of those things aside, at the very beginning, our first day together as a team from all over the region of the Midwest, from different schools and states and experiences, that when we share what was in our hearts and what was on our mind coming in, I think we casted out that double-mindedness. We casted out the doubt and any of the fear going in, and that we were ready as a team to start serving. And I think that's very necessary when we go on God's mission, is that we need to cast out all the fear and doubt that's around. And that's how you can share God's love with the people, when you're not questioning it yourself, when people can see it in your life. And in China, when it's difficult to share openly your faith, what you have to do is live it out. You have to let them see through an example in your life what it means to you. And especially the people where we went in 2008, they're from one of the poorest regions in China. These are people who they go to college because their parents have sacrificed everything to put them there. They don't know what they're going to do in the future, but their job is to provide for their families in the future. And when they are still seeking to find themselves in college, when they're striving to seek who they are, what they'll amount to be in the future, but then they encounter Americans, when they encounter friends from another country that have no doubt on who they are. We don't know what the future has for us, but we do have faith in someone who does, and we have God. And when we bring that with us, when we have that on our hearts, we're not bringing God to China. We're showing the people there that God has always been there, and He's ready to accept them. So when we lack wisdom to deal with the trials, we need to ask for God in faith and not in double-mindedness. Pride is one of the most dangerous attacks to our faith, and we saw that in the story with the Emperor's New Clothes. When you're so prideful, when you're so arrogant that you don't see yourself in the mirror, when you don't think logically that there's probably no such thing as invisible thread, that we blind ourselves to what is reality, and we feel like we can do things on our own. We push God's hand aside, and all the trust and obedience with it. But instead, when we trust and obey God and His call for our lives, we can push aside all fear and doubt that causes us to stumble, that causes us to be afraid. But when we give into it, that's not what God has in mind for us. That's not what God's plan is for us, is to fall into that fear and doubt. But to help us to lack nothing, lack no wisdom, and to face life for all of its worth. Knowing that when we ask God in faith, when we receive wisdom, that's what we're seeking. That this is the heart of why Jesus really came to the earth, is to die for us. He came so that when we go through trials, when we go through difficulties, we can rely on Him and not wandering in our own lostness as sheep and in our own ignorance, but hopefully finding faith in God, knowing that He is the source. So I encourage you to trust in God, have faith in God, knowing that as difficult as it is, seeing my own experiences in college, I've seen friends turn the other way. I've seen friends leave their faith, but I've also had friends abandon friendship because of our obedience to God. And when we don't know what to do in those situations, when we're struggling, when we're having a hard time, those are the times when God really shows that He's there. When we put that faith back into Him, when we lack the wisdom, the courage to stand strong in our faith, God is there. So I challenge you, think about that throughout this week. Maybe the ways that we've been relying on ourselves for our own wisdom, for what we should be doing, that sometimes throughout our degrees, or even in our future ministries, like currently in my own ministry, not knowing where that's going to lead, but trusting in God, trusting in the faith and the plan that He has for us, not putting it into question, not following our own pride, but submitting to Him. And that comes through obedience of faith. So when we truly devote ourselves to God, when we know and realize that we ourselves aren't wise, that we're actually lacking that, when we go through these difficulties and the challenges, have faith. Don't question it. Don't doubt it. Don't have that double-mindedness on our hearts, and know that God will provide. That's an example that I've seen in my life. That's an example that I've seen in many of my friends' lives. There are so many examples in ministry, throughout the church, and throughout history. That's in our Word. That's in Scripture. That we see faithful people that didn't know where they were going to go. That we see that in examples like Abraham, like Moses, people who were called by God, who questioned what this would look like, who feared what might happen, but they had faith, and they experienced difficulties and trials. But when they walked by faith with God, He revealed the way that He had for them, and it was perfect. And He established a plan through them. And we remember them today as some of the greatest fathers of faith for Christianity. So I encourage you, live by faith. When you do have those questions and challenges that push you to persevere, believe that wisdom comes from God, and have faith. And He'll save you from the double-mindedness.